You're seeing essentially the war over the push for more drugs and more procedures, as opposed to just listening to our bodies, making lifestyle changes, making dietary changes, understanding that perhaps the problem that you're having can be solved with one thing. And that one thing you'd have to essentially find throughout this morass of the system, because nobody is essentially going to tell you.
You must be some kind of therapist.
Today I'm welcoming back to the podcast Diana Lutfi. She's an independent legal expert, healthcare regulatory and bioethics consultant, and coalition movement builder. You may have originally heard her on this podcast on episode 138, where we discussed the United States versus Skrmetti Supreme Court case, in which Diana played a role helping put together a detransitioner's amicus brief. Today we're going to talk about how broken the American healthcare system is. Diana has some insight on that, and I might get an opportunity to rant about a personal saga. And besides that, we have important news to discuss with regard to Colorado House Bill 26-1322, called Civil Actions for Conversion Therapy Survivors, which appears to have been a reaction to the Chiles versus Salazar Supreme Court victory. So Diana, I'm so glad to have you here to talk about what the heck is going on in Colorado, which I have deemed unofficially, according to me, the worst state to be a parent in the United States. Worse than the whole West Coast. So the parents in our audience and everyone following the gender wars and the therapy wars definitely going to want to stay tuned for your expertise on that. Before we get into Colorado and my conversation with today's guest, Diana Lutfi, I want to give you a personal on-ramp into the subject of just how broken the American healthcare system is, because I just personally lived through it. In our conversation, I explained all of this to Diana, but that story took too long, so I'm giving you a condensed version instead. So for context, I do not trust the American healthcare system, and I don't trust health insurance. I think it's a scam, so I'm on a health share plan instead, and I am accustomed to paying for things out of pocket, many of which I'll never be reimbursed for, and some of which I will. I recently ran headfirst into the system's brokenness with a gastrointestinal problem. It started with acid reflux and abdominal pain. I went to a gastroenterologist, answered several intake questions, and the answers apparently meant that I needed a $3,000 procedure called an endoscopy under sedation, which would send a camera down through my esophagus to the upper small intestine to rule out ulcers, tumors, and visible damage to my esophagus and stomach. It took me a while to get the procedure scheduled because I had a cold and work, and it was about 6 weeks until I could finally have the procedure. The whole time I was suffering, and I was taking over-the-counter antacids, which ended up making the problem much worse. When I finally did the procedure, there was nothing visibly wrong with any of the tissues that the camera was able to examine. The biopsies for celiac and H. pylori will take a few more weeks to come back still, but I expect those to be negative as well. But here's the thing. At the very first appointment where I sought care for acid reflux, I told the doctor at the time that I was burping a lot, which is not common for me, something I never really experienced before, frequent belching. That is a classic sign of SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth. Not one of the 3 doctors I talked to at that clinic ever raised the possibility that SIBO might be part of the problem. In fact, some of them even had this attitude of, well, some doctors don't even believe in SIBO, as if it's a belief system, not a diagnosable and treatable condition. So it took me doing my own research and connecting the dots myself. SIBO produces gas that pushes stomach acid upwards. That's what was causing my reflux. And the acid-suppressing drugs that they kept steering me toward and that I was relying on while waiting for the endoscopy end results can actually cause or worsen SIBO. Meanwhile, I had multiple doctors reassuring me that being on a proton pump inhibitor for life would be no big deal. The problem was that taking antacids to manage my condition in the interim did worsen my underlying condition and shifted the location of the pains that I was experiencing profound cramping sensations in my mid-abdomen. What this means is that the SIBO was likely causing the acid reflux in the first place, and as one would predict, suppressing acid worsened the problem. So by the time I begged to get tested for SIBO, I was in a lot of pain every day and taking a lot of over-the-counter things and supplements just to get through each day. I was also on an extremely restrictive diet. I went low FODMAP and I lost 8 pounds. I had to beg to get tested for SIBO nonetheless. I had to come up with that hypothesis myself, book a new appointment to present it to a new provider. I had to take a lot of action on my part to expedite the process of getting tested. And then I had to chase down the results, which came to my patient portal looking blank, and pull out of a nurse the phrase hydrogen positive, methane negative. That nurse didn't know what it meant. Thankfully, I did. I already knew the drug that I needed, which is called rifaximin. The brand name is called Xifaxan. Then it got worse. I learned that that drug costs $2,000 plus. I'd assumed that it was available as a generic. Turns out the generic is available in Canada, but not the US for some reason. And unfortunately, my lack of knowledge about the cost of this drug was communicated to the wrong nurse at the wrong moment. And that resulted in a miscommunication where the doctor thought I wanted a cheaper alternative before I knew what the cheaper alternative was. The doctor wasn't responding to any of my messages, wasn't calling me, wasn't responding in the portal. Everything was getting routed through staff. While the doctor remained silent on me, though, I finally heard that they sent in a prescription for a cheaper alternative called Cipro. Cipro is a cheap antibiotic in a class called fluoroquinolones that carry a black box warning for permanent neurological damage. The only reason that I knew to refuse this drug was that I had happened to have recently come across social media content warning against what this drug can do to people. Surely enough, when I heard that name Cipro, I opened the X app and searched for it, and the first thing I saw was actually a former guest of this podcast, Dr. Joseph Witt-Doering, who has been on here to talk about the harms of psychiatry. I saw a clip of Dr. Witt-Doering saying he would never let anyone in his family take Cipro or any kind of fluoroquinolone. So once again, I'm doing my own research. The doctor is not communicating with me to ask my preferences. The doctor simply assumes, because he hears from a nurse that I'm just learning about the cost of Xifaxan, he just assumes that I'm going to want the cheap alternative, and he doesn't take into account my medical history. Here's why this matters for me. I'm a POTS patient. I have dysautonomia. My nervous system is already not working optimally, and I'm on 3 medications when I'd rather be on 0 just to manage day to day. So no, I'm not going to risk taking a drug that could permanently damage my nervous system. I would rather spend the $2,000. But because the doctor isn't responding to any of my messages in the patient portal, isn't calling me back, everything seems to be miscommunicating, getting routed through different people answering the phone, I end up physically going to the clinic, making eye contact with a human being to explain the miscommunication. Oh, and by the way, I had told the doctor now several times that I had this upcoming family vacation that was very important to me, that my symptoms were currently at such a level that I wouldn't be able to enjoy the vacation at all. I was worried about ruining it, and that I would really like to complete the 2-week course of antibiotic before the vacation. If he had responded in a timely way, that would have been possible. It is possible because I made it happen, but that's because I chased down people. So the next thing that happened is that I went to the clinic, made eye contact with a human being, explained the miscommunication, and asked to please receive a prescription as soon as possible for the $2,000 plus drug. I was also in touch with my pharmacy to find out if they had it in stock. I knew what it cost, that's what it took. And so by this point, I'd repeatedly explained to the doctor through messages of various types that I was trying to get on the drug of choice, Xifaxan, for this condition, and that I needed to complete the 2-week course of antibiotic before the trip, which was about 2.5 weeks out. My situation, however, was treated with no urgency. That's why I had to go make eye contact with the nurse, explain it to her, ask for her help advocating for me, have her call the doctor after hours. He still didn't respond to any of my messages in the portal, but finally, the prescription for Xifaxan showed up at my local pharmacy. So this is a prescription that I'd begged for the diagnosis, then I'd begged for the right treatment. I'd had to decline the wrong treatment, which could have done permanent neurological damage. I finally pick up the prescription, and when I receive it, I learn that he's prescribed it twice a day instead of 3 times a day. 14 days either way, but 3 times a day for 14 days is the standard of care that I'd read about online. And apparently it is pretty universal. I don't know why he prescribed it twice a day. Maybe he was trying to save me money, but he never asked me if I wanted him to cut corners. He never asked me if I was trying to save money. He simply assumed, I guess, So while this saved me a few $100s, he never asked me if my preference was to cut corners or to have the most effective form of treatment. So once again, I had to help myself, do my own research, and figure out that with the gap that left between breakfast and dinner, I should continue taking the herbal supplement oregano oil as an antimicrobial with my midday meal to ensure a steady stream of antimicrobials. I will also mention somewhere in the middle of all of this, I had a telehealth urgent care visit in which I was told that I needed to go to in-person urgent care. And there they basically spent no time on differential diagnosis and floated the idea that it might be a gallstone. And because of that, erring on the side of caution, I might need to go to the ER. There was no real workup. My later research told me it would have taken a couple minutes more of asking questions for her to do the differential diagnosis. I just had to ask my intuition, do I have a gallstone? No, I did not have a gallstone. And she could have done that through a differential diagnosis, but she treated it in a very surface way. So I wasn't given any real guidance as to whether or not I needed to go to the ER. But no, I don't have a gallstone. Anyway, now I'm on Xifaxan. My symptoms are already changing. I even had to figure out my own diet because I had told this doctor that I'd adopted a low FODMAP diet to manage before getting the Xifaxan. And he never told me that although the low FODMAP diet does manage symptoms, it also sends the bacteria into hiding, sort of hibernation mode, because it deprives the bacteria of their preferred food. And as a result, the low FODMAP diet makes it harder for the Xifaxan to do its job. In other words, when you're on Xifaxan, you should not be following a low FODMAP diet. In fact, there's a supplement you can take, which I'd already started taking because of my own research, called PHGG, partially hydrogenated or hydrolyzed guar gum. And taking PHGG, which is a certain type of fiber, with Xifaxan actually increases the chance that it will do its job properly. So I had to do my own research once again and find out what type of diet I should or should not be on while on Xifaxan treatment. The doctor never told me any of that. So when I finally went back to meet online with my naturopathic primary care physician, who's not a specialist, I realized and told her that I wished I'd worked with her from the start. She actually has plenty of experience treating SIBO and was well familiar with the protocol I designed for myself in the absence of real care. My doctor was disturbed that the gastroenterologist prescribed me Xifaxan twice a day rather than 3 times a day, which is, as she said, the standard for everyone. It's not because I'm smaller or anything like that. She did confirm that the standard for any patient like me with these symptoms would be to take it 3 times a day. So she didn't know why he prescribed any less. She is currently chasing down my medical records to try to find out what my hydrogen gas levels were and why he prescribed it at that frequency. But considering how severe my symptoms were, I'm guessing that my levels were actually pretty high. My doctor validated the supplement plan that I'd come up with myself. The diet plan that I'd come up with myself, and just added a few adjustments, a few new pieces of information that were helpful. And my doctor, my naturopathic primary care physician, also helped me work out a plan for obtaining generic rifaximin from a Canadian pharmacy for much less should I need it again. So if you happen to be experiencing any of this yourself and you need to know, in the US, it's $2,000+ for brand name Xifaxan. That's all you can get. Apparently, Canadian pharmacies, it's like $100, but you have to go through some extra hoops and it takes longer to arrive. So it's about 4 to 6 weeks to get the Canadian generic, and I'll probably just go through that in case my symptoms come back. So the moral of the story and what really stuck with me is that to get through this, I had to be my own advocate, do my own research. I had to have excellent communication skills. I had to have a willingness to fight for myself, the willingness to treat someone who sees himself as an authority, as an equal, and the willingness to trust my own intuition. And the whole time I was met with this attitude that frankly felt quite dismissive, and it felt like they were like, oh, another middle-aged white lady with digestive pain, it must be anxiety. So I actually broke down crying to my husband and explained my feeling, like, what about the people who don't have the same skills as me? What about people who don't have the IQ, the verbal skills, the healthcare system navigation skills, the fighting spirit, whatever it might be? What about the people who didn't happen across a piece of content on social media about the black box warning on Cipro and other fluoroquinolones? What about people who are wary of using AI and would never research their symptoms to find out that the small intestine bacterial overgrowth actually makes sense as the explanation for why I was having acid reflux in the first place? What about all of those people who aren't me, who could have the same symptoms and could be stuck with them for life, who would be stuck on a proton pump inhibitor for life, which weakens their stomach acid, which creates further digestive pain downstream. The people who don't know how to ask for SIBO testing or don't know how to fight back against a false negative, because I also learned that while I did test positive, there are a lot of false negatives when it comes to SIBO testing. What about people who don't have the money to pay out of pocket for a $2,000 antibiotic or for oregano oil and allicin and PHGG and all of these other drugs, or who don't have the knowledge or income or self-discipline to put themselves on a low FODMAP diet? I mean, there's so many ways that this could have broken down, and it's only because of all the strengths that I have at this point in my life, which I haven't necessarily had at other points in my life, and which I might not have if I, get older and lose some of my abilities. It's just very sad that I had to work this hard to be my own advocate, and what that says about how other patients are treated. So that's the story that I shared with Diana in a much less organized way than I shared with you just now. I hope I was able to condense it a little bit. And that's where I'm going to hand it off to Diana and bring her into the conversation, because the problems in the healthcare system are her world and her field of expertise. Here's Diana's response to my story.
That's been part of the merge on a national scale to understand chronic diseases, but also to figure out how to reform the system. And the first sort of element is actually getting more physicians talking about like underlying causes, as well as whether or not what they're doing within their protocols are working, helping, or harming the patients that they're claiming to essentially help. And that's part, it's huge. This has been an ongoing effort. There are definitely advocacy groups and organizations out there that are talking a little bit more about like giving patients and giving people a lot more information. The problem is at the highest level, whether or not you're taking that generic drug versus the $2,000 drug, you wouldn't have had that information if you didn't have Joseph Whitdoring on. If he didn't even disclose some of those black box warnings, as well as all sorts of issues in terms of how that complicates the body further, that wouldn't have gotten to you. You wouldn't have had any information. You would have taken the drug that was prescribed, and countless thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of Americans do. So at the highest level within government, that has to get reformed. And that's in part what HHS and Kennedy and the FDA is trying to do right now. It's just extraordinarily difficult because any individual or any organization that does try to make those changes happen, that tries to essentially take an active step towards reforming, even if you have very accurate and robust scientific data, you would have to essentially convince individuals that are used to not just making their profit, but who've trained their brains to essentially see healthcare and see their patients in a particular way. It's a paradigm shift. That's what we're entering into. And your experience essentially demonstrates a lot of that.
I remember the first gastroenterologist I spoke with. It felt like half his job, he was kind enough, but it felt like half his job was just mentally preparing me for a life of being on PPIs, on proton pump inhibitors. And, having had a sharp decrease in my health in my 30s, which I'm now several years into that. I'm in my 40s. I'm stabilized compared to what I was, but like I am already on 3 medications and I'd rather be on none. I already have to walk within very tight guardrails in terms of my diet, my lifestyle, everything, if I want to be able to function. And so I wasn't just going to accept that, but it felt like that is the standard of care. And encountering this over and over and over, these drug pushers who don't even want to bother to do a differential diagnosis. Oh, I forgot to talk about the urgent care visit. I had an urgent care visit somewhere in there because I had like a telehealth urgent care visit, and they were like, "Yeah, you need to go to urgent care." So I went to urgent care, and this lady spent like no time on differential diagnosis. But because she identified it was possible that this was actually a gallstone, she was like, "Well, it could be a gallstone, in which case you need to go to the ER." And I was like, "Well, do you really think I have a gallstone?" And she's like, "I can't really tell you, just erring on the side of caution. It could be a gallstone." So once again, I had to do my own research, tap into my own intuition, ask my body, "Do I have a gallstone?" And my body was like, "No, you don't have a gallstone. That's not what this is." And I thought about, like, it would have taken her 5 more minutes to ask 20 questions that would have helped with a differential diagnosis. And it's like, as a patient, you have to be your own best advocate. You have to be not too afraid of conflict. You have to have good verbal communication skills, good research skills. You have to be willing to honor your intuition. You have to be willing to treat someone who views himself as an authority figure as an equal. And if you don't have all that, I mean, I honestly broke down crying to my husband, and this is gonna sound like I'm really full of myself, but I was like, "What about people who aren't as smart as me? Okay? These are my skills. I'm a professional communicator. Like, what about people who don't have those communication skills?"
Again, this is what makes it really, really scary. Within the context of the profession, if you advocate too strongly to the wrong person, they can essentially consider you more than just an incompetent patient. They can essentially hold you. And that's what's essentially happened within the psychiatric community. This is essentially why we're at war. And it's more than just a war over medical freedom. In the average daily person's context, it is. But it is a war over whether or not the hopefully the hospital system and the physician that you're essentially visiting would allow you to uh, basically advocate for yourself versus if they're not.
There is a lot of gaslighting in the psychiatric system, and I feel like that's opening a whole can of worms because that's my field and I've worked there, and I see it both ways. But this is one of those things that they try to cancel me over too, is when I say things like, "Hey, look, we actually have psychiatric survivors who swear by a ketogenic diet, and it fixed them. It fixed them. They were psychotic, they were hallucinating, they were homeless, they were delusional, and switching to a ketogenic diet completely fixed their psychosis." Like, we ought to listen to that, and people try to cancel me over saying this too.
Literally. And so that's you're seeing that war. You're seeing essentially the war over the push for more drugs and more procedures as opposed to just listening to our bodies, making lifestyle changes, making dietary changes, understanding that perhaps the problem that you're having can be solved with one thing. And that one thing, you'd have to essentially find throughout this morass of the system because nobody is essentially going to tell you. Yeah. That's what makes it so much more challenging and so much more difficult. There are emerging healthcare technologies that are exciting, novel, but the sort of limitations is convincing them that dietary supplements changes individuals like Dr. Joseph actually know how to essentially sift through this morass of medical research because other doctors don't. They don't believe in that, right? All that every single academic does is they go through research and they essentially determine whether or not they're going to trust certain sorts of things. All an organization ends up doing, like the AMA and WPATH and others that you've essentially witnessed, they go through whatever sort of highest regarded medical journal, medical authority, and they say, see, we have this study without anyone actually looking at whether or not the data is producing the results that it's claiming.
You know, we have these, like, TV shows that are popular, and I don't watch them, so I don't even know what they are. I feel like maybe House is one of them, but there's the fantasy of the doctor that, like, plays Sherlock Holmes, right? The fantasy of the doctor who really cares about the differential diagnosis, who's passionate about finding a solution for this patient and uncovering, the thing that makes it all better, and I feel like there's a reason that we have those TV shows because they appeal to the fantasy in us of someone taking our pain seriously, taking their job seriously as a detective who's going to get to the bottom of things. And I feel like that's not how the system actually works. The system is designed to keep people sufficing.
That's part of the challenges. There's an emerging movement of independent physicians and independent practitioners that really do love their jobs, and I have seen them essentially play with Sherlock, right? They're doing their best to basically treat every single person and every single patient with the best of their knowledge and abilities. But the problem is they're not necessarily even able to talk about standard of care reform, because that's a massive, like, industry shift. And that industry shift is tense, mostly because a lot of the drugs that are out in the public, now we have to start essentially questioning whether or not they're treating the conditions that they're claiming, and whether or not people should have been diagnosed with those conditions to begin with. And that's part of the problem, right? That's why, like, I made a chart. um, we
And
are entering
wait,
into science wars.
Okay, so before we bring out the chart, I want to frame this because
Sure.
when you say standard of care, we talked about the BS of the WPATH standards of care on this podcast, and how WPATH is a fraudulent group of activists with an agenda who identify as a professional organization. And WPATH has made up their standards and identified them as these standards of care, right? Which is a term that has a different meaning in the medical world. And so we've looked on this podcast a lot how fraudulent the WPATH standards of care are compared to the word standards, or the phrase standards of care, just being something that's supposed to have a meaning. But now what we're getting into is we're branching into other fields of medicine, and we're going to talk about how the phrase standards of care, I mean, the standard of care I just discovered for a patient with acid reflux is you put them on a PPI for life, and you let them develop small intestine bacterial overgrowth, and you let them live with chronic fatigue because they're not getting nutrition out of their food. That's the standard of care I'm discovering if someone has acid reflux, rather than, well, why do they have acid reflux? What's causing the acid reflux? Can we fix that? So now you're going to show us our chart, and remember that a lot of our listeners are just listening, they're not watching. So if you're on YouTube, you'll be able to see Diana's visual, and if you're just listening, we're going to walk you through what's on her chart. Go ahead and hold that up as still as you can for the screen.
Sure. So I think the best way for me to talk about this is to talk about the timeline, right? From the last podcast that we had, in terms of Skrmetti, the United States versus Skrmetti case, if anyone has followed it, or any sort of knowledge of it, what it did in the academic legal community, and in the broader academic community, is it revealed the undergirding war. There were 25 states, 26 states, right, that had supported the detransitioners, that had said, we're going to ban this. But the assault on banning it was an assault on the entire academic system, right? The entire medical system's standard of care. That was essentially the war. That's what they went after. That's why AMA essentially partnered alongside several other organizations and said, no, we're not going to stand for this. We're going to fight. We're going to keep people essentially on these standards because we truly believe that we're helping them. And here's the narrative that we're essentially going to push. And that's the plaintiff's narrative, right? And what that revealed throughout the country, is there is a civil war over all of these states and over how do we care for each other and what is a essential role of science in society. The problem is most people aren't really talking about it. Bioethics as an industry, and as an emerging industry, never really touched upon something called standards of care. It was only years later that it had gained its prominence because people were doing unethical research, right? So we had witnessed Tuskegee, we'd witnessed a couple of different sort of unethical scientific experiments, but those experiments are not considered standard. The standard is essentially what's already mainstream accepted by everyone in the profession to be what's right. That doesn't necessarily make it right. Gender affirming care is one of them. There are many, many other sorts of topics. And your personal medical experience ends up essentially kind of outlining the standard of care in gastroenterology, like is to essentially go after the most rigorous procedure and then charge you and say, hey, like this is essentially what you're going to have to just deal with the rest of your life. And the poor individuals that believe in all of that are the several thousands, if not the countless of Americans that depend on it, that almost believe that that's essentially what they have to do. That's just life. That's not. And that's what we're seeing. There's almost an unraveling of the individuals that are essentially within the system, kind of recognizing that perhaps the system and perhaps what we're telling people is not true, does not necessarily even line up with the latest research. And in the final straw, like, why are we giving people black box warning for their conditions? We don't have to do any of that. And that shift is essentially emerging. But in order for that shift to take place and in order for more people to have justice on like the detransitioner front, we need to start talking and defining what science is, as well as all of the standards and all of the research that kind of go into someone saying that this is science, that these standards are essentially based on science. That's the science wars. Last year, from like the moment that the detransitioner movement kind of came about and got consolidated because of that brief, I discovered that a lot of this was essentially also centralizing around RFK. So whether or not you like him or hate him or are indifferent to him, he rose into prominence, and this was essentially my background. I was his law clerk, so I'd actually seen a lot of the horrifying data that had kind of emerged with the context of public health and the pandemic. And we had like communities, if not individual members in people essentially emerging and trying to speak up, trying to just say, you know, we should have the right to say no. We should have the right to essentially say we don't trust something. We don't trust the system. We don't trust the government. And we don't necessarily trust healthcare to essentially say, hey, like this is essentially what you need to do, right? But in order to tip him over, what we had witnessed, all right, after the detransitioners ended up asking me, saying, we want to support RFK, had to consolidate all of them and, push that through. But now there's an emerging 6,000 physicians throughout the country that also support RFK. And that's not heard of. That's not necessarily out in the news because the mainstream news does not necessarily want people to know, oh my gosh, there are other individuals that are recognizing that shift has to happen. So 6,000 physicians, scientists, healthcare practitioners, doctors, Eitan Heim, Joseph was not necessarily part of that, but he's also part of like independent medical associations, list of physicians, individuals that are essentially emerging and talking about like the problems within the system. And the craziest part of all of this is here's where Lawfare comes in. So Lawfare, the first front of Lawfare, and this is the Colorado bill that we'll get into, it's to essentially curb professional speech. If more healthcare professionals start recognizing that they have the power and the ability to start talking about what is wrong within the system and whether or not the patients that are being almost held captive by these systems are um, essentially being hurt. When they have that ability, when they have that authority, um, that's where a lot of the changes can start to emerge, right? So Joseph had protected his license by um, going independent. There's a movement of a whole bunch of physicians trying to be independent and trying to figure out the states where their license are not necessarily going to get yanked. And unfortunately, in the context of Colorado, it's not necessarily the worst family friendly states. They're the state on its core is trying to protect the patient, but they're doing so by curbing professional speech, right? And they're essentially viewpoint discriminating against uh, any licensed professional that does not adhere to how they view standards of care.
Your trans-identified kid won't listen to reason because reason isn't what they need right now. They need a parent who knows how to communicate in an empathic yet strategic manner. ROGD Repair gives you over 120 lessons in the psychology and communication tools that actually work when normal parenting doesn't. Plus, RepairBot, your 24/7 AI coach trained on my entire body of work, ready to help you navigate tough moments in real time. Visit rogdrepair.com and use code SOMETherapist2026 to take half off your first month.
I want to acknowledge that when we have conversations like this about not trusting the system and healthcare freedom and all that kind of stuff, we sound paranoid. And, those of us with more paranoid traits might find ourselves in this space more. Those of us with issues trusting authority, myself included, right? And it's easy to dismiss our perspectives based on that, but I think it's also important to acknowledge when certain powers have lost people's trust, when they've done things to undermine that trust, right? And that's part of the reason I started with my story, as long-winded as it was, because it's like I did go to the professional gastroenterologists hoping for a higher quality of care within the system. And unfortunately, what I discovered is very similar to what I've discovered in other fields. Like for example, in gynecology, the standard of care is throw women on birth control and throw them on Lupron and bone density be damned and mental health be damned. And who cares about those studies saying that birth control increases the risk of suicide? Come on. Come on, right? Like that it changes who you're sexually attracted to. I mean, do we wanna look at the connections between birth control and the divorce rate? Women marrying men they were attracted to when they were on synthetic hormones, and then they go off of hormones, they get pregnant, they have a kid, and suddenly he's disgusting and he doesn't smell right? Okay, so I already had my experiences with all of that before gastroenterology, but even someone paranoid like me, even a smarty pants know-it-all who doesn't trust authority, who has I have very little respect for social hierarchy, like, that's my personality. But even someone like me, I can be vulnerable and try to trust them sometimes, and I'm let down every time. So, I just wanna acknowledge because I know there are certain listeners who, they might be a little bit, more normie, a little less paranoid and obsessive like me, and it might sound, eh, you know and I understand how it sounds paranoid when you haven't had your trust broken over and over again, but we have to look at how these healthcare authorities have handled one thing after another. And for many listeners of this podcast, the gender issue is like the one and only issue that drove them into realizing there was a problem, or they've tried trusting therapists and been shocked and let down, like so many of my clients have, to discover that even a therapist they thought they vetted well ended up trying to pressure them into using their kid's new name and pronouns, showing total ignorance. I mean, even therapists who supposedly recognize the harms of these kids going on life-altering hormones, when they encourage that little bit of so-called compromise, it really shows ignorance as to how these things work because the goalposts will keep shifting, right? So I just want to acknowledge that yes, personality and temperament play a role. Yes, someone like me tends to be more obsessive and paranoid, and it can make us sound crazy. I recognize that. But also, trust has been lost for reasons. And that's the kind of stuff that you're talking about. And so I don't feel like we completely went over your chart though. Do you want to just pull it back up and maybe put it a little closer to the screen and show us, cuz I think you were trying to point out something about this identity wars section.
Yeah. So a lot of what's going on right now started with the identity wars. And it starts with individuals kind of coming in and questioning like what it means to be human, but more so like how to essentially relate to the world, and to society and to the people that are essentially around them. We hadn't had any of those topics or discussions in the context of academia and education. Instead, what we had was gender studies, right? Which was kind of the emergence of essentially pushing for uh, a very distinct, like pro like gender fluidity agenda. Um, and that's also where a lot of the conservatives and a lot of the individuals that had garnered their support for detransitioners are also recognizing. That's also why we have 26 states essentially in the country that are talking a lot about, like, okay, we need to start protecting people against medical abuse. So the government needs to essentially start stepping up because the medical community won't. And that's where we get into the science wars. Because on a legal level, part of the problem is we have created within the legal system, any regulated profession is self-regulated within that profession. So your license is essentially dictated and controlled by other therapists, in the context of law. That's where the deference of judicial authority will go towards, on a state by state by state level. Uh, Similarly, any sort of doctor, any sort of nurse, um, anyone that essentially has a license, including lawyers, their license is essentially dictated by the legal authority that governs their sort of profession. It's not necessarily controlled nor dictated by the government, right? What the government can end up doing is the government can end up creating laws like the one that you're talking about in terms of Colorado to start shifting what a regulated professional can or cannot do.
And then it starts looking really wacky from inside the profession. So we're going to get into that. I'm sure some listeners have suffered through my gastroenterology saga just to get to this more on topic subject of what's going on in Colorado as what do I want to say? Colorado, like a hotbed for the culture war over this issue right now.
Colorado is a hotbed over the censorship of professional speech. So that tends to be Colorado's niche. They've censored even attorney speech, right? So there was a previous case of a attorney that had um, passionately advocated for his client before a judge that he considered unfair, and because he ended up calling the judge fat gay guy, the term gay used in any sort of derogatory way uh, triggered licensing disciplinary action in the state of Colorado. And it triggered disciplinary action against his attorney license, which is crazy. But that's the state of Colorado. That's the regulated speech censorship in Colorado. And so that's essentially also playing out with regards to like other regulated professions, right? So in therapy, and in speech therapy, Colorado used to have a law that essentially outline that they were not going to allow any therapists, anyone essentially practicing in the public context to talk openly about a non-affirmation only model. So if you had a client and you said, let's actually explore your identity, your natal sex identity, that would be essentially prohibited under Colorado's original ban.
So this is where I want to be very careful and very specific because things that I've said on this podcast have ended up being heard by people in a way that it becomes a game of telephone that gets further and further away from the truth. Let me give an example. I'm going to read a text from a beloved friend of mine. Absolutely no shade to this friend, but this is a text that a friend sent me that I think does a good job of summarizing what people sound like when they get it wrong on this issue. And it's not their fault. It's because they're following this issue and they're not therapy professionals, they're not legal professionals, they're just keeping up with the culture war. They're trying to understand. They end up getting it wrong, and here's what it sounds like. Okay, so my friend texted me the other day. I have a dumb question about gender affirming care, but wanting to make sure I'm clear on how it works. I get that if you have a client who says, quote, I'm trans, you're required to affirm, and the next step is referral for medicalization. Talk therapy or questioning is off the table at this point. Is the same true if a client says, quote, I think I might be trans, or something to that effect that expresses ambiguity or uncertainty? What are the guidelines? Should you ask them, quote, what makes you doubt that you're trans, or something like that? What's the correct response according to GAC? In other words, gender affirming care. So this is what my friend texts me. God bless his heart for trying to understand the issue. This is not accurate, okay? So I text back, not exactly accurate, too detailed to text, and we ended up having a conversation later this day. But it's a good description of what people come to me with all the time, saying, okay, I understand you're required to affirm, but blah, 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 blah. Hold on, you're not required to affirm. People need to understand this point. Here is my understanding, Diana, and you can tell me if there's somewhere that you know I'm factually incorrect.
Okay.
Number one, it's regulated state by state.
Yes.
Laws vary by state.
Yes.
But the definition of conversion therapy is nationwide. It was redefined during the Obama administration from sexual orientation change efforts to sexual orientation and gender identity and expression change efforts during the Obama administration. Do we agree on those facts before we proceed?
Yes and no. So,
Okay, where do you disagree?
yes, as in it was defined nationally. No, as in it can still be redefined on a state by state level.
So some states might actually choose not to include SOGIECE. They might choose to exclude gender identity and expression and have laws that specifically govern SOCE, sexual orientation change efforts, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So just making
Yes.
sure we're keeping pace with each other
Yep.
so far, right? So I am licensed in Oregon. My friend who texted me is in California. He might be thinking of a family in Colorado. Individual state laws vary.
Yeah.
But now I want to talk about the phrase required to affirm. So again, going to give you an opportunity, going to give Diana an opportunity to correct anything where you know that I'm wrong. But here is my understanding. I don't know of any state with any law that specifically uses that language. Therapists are required to affirm. That is, in my opinion, not a correct interpretation of the existing laws. What I would say is that the laws that do exist, which govern so-called sexual orientation and gender identity and expression change efforts, create a chilling and hostile atmosphere in which therapists with a conscience that's more aligned with mine are extremely reluctant in that chilling and hostile atmosphere to explore matters of gender and sexual identity and gender expression because of the hostility towards the perception that there is an effort at changing this thing.
So that's a very general statement. That applies to certain very distinct states, California being one of them, because California actually gives licensed professionals a lot of leeway within their regulated profession to practice based on their understanding of an issue. They might, feel uncomfortable with their colleagues and with whatever national associations, but that is part of the reason why the Chiles versus Salazar case became a national Supreme Court case and why we had liberal justices essentially siding with Chiles in that case. Colorado regulates speech. Colorado legally does not make a distinction between your personal speech and your professional speech. So if you end up having a client and you are licensed in the state of Colorado and you say, let's explore or let's do something any different than their gender affirming care affirmation only model, your license is not only on the line, but you can lose it. You can lose it as an attorney just as much. So in the state of Colorado, if you are licensed in that particular state, and there are some other states that basically also govern licensing too, it is much more than just let's bravely speak out. It is you can and you might end up having to essentially fight for your position and fight for your license. And part of the reason why Colorado ended up essentially doubling down after the Chiles versus Salazar decision with SCOTUS is because they know that their legislature can essentially create another scope within the context of law that would give recourse if licensed professionals end up speaking and, going and anything can be qualified as a non-affirmation only model. So they the case was mostly about conversion therapy, but it undergirds a lot of the laws that make up the licensed professional speech. No one really talks about that in the context of Colorado because Colorado has a really good job of not only disguising that, but you have to find the actual regulatory codes that undergirds those statements.
Hang
So in the
on, wait.
context,
Sorry, I'm sorry. I feel like we're rushing through this, and I
it's
feel
a lot.
I feel it's very important to me because I have actually been
Yeah.
criticized. There is a gender critical therapist out there. I don't even know her name, but she has criticized me for she thinks fear mongering about this issue
Yeah.
because I haven't always been specific enough. So here's the thing. I don't feel comfortable using the language required to affirm unless we can point to where in the law it says required to affirm. And if that's not
So
what it says, I want to know what it does say because I think people are hungry for accurate information. And I know that I can stand on what I said when I said that the SOGIECE laws create a chilling and hostile
yeah,
environment. But if you mean something else, Diana, let's find the words. Let's make sure that we can represent accurately what the law actually says.
we are looking at regulatory licensing wars. So what does that mean? If you go into what you're able to essentially say and not say, you have to go through your essential board. In the state of Colorado, those professional licensing boards have something called the catch-all unprofessional conduct. Within the context of unprofessional conduct, uh, they have specific sort of policies. Some of those policies are outlined in the state, and others you have to essentially do deep database research in order to discover that. In the state of Colorado, I did research on 4 licensed professionals, including essentially social workers and therapists. In so far as there is that sort of model, anything that is any speech that any licensed professional says that goes against an affirmation-only model that is reported to the Colorado board will be qualified as unprofessional conduct. They will not actively say that because in law, the broader context of a legislation or a policy or a regulation does not necessarily have to be actively defined. So administrative authority, like statewide authority, is governed by the profession that it is. The broader you make a legal language, so in the state of Colorado, for example, unprofessional conduct, that's governed by the board. That determination on whether or not a conduct or a speech is professional or not professional, whether or not what you did was right or wrong in the context of your patient, in the context of the people that comes to you, is governed by that board. So whenever a complaint occurs, it triggers a board investigation. And what the board ends up looking at is whether or not they have the legal authority to essentially yank that person's license or to hold that person in lower regard, to issue a disciplinary notice, to issue a warning, to basically say curb your speech. In the context of Colorado, that language is not quote unquote required to. No law has language that is in the context of healthcare professionals that says required to. What happens administratively is you have a broadening subset of authority, so unprofessional conduct, right? Or whatever the undergirding regulation is, and it trickles down. And it doesn't just create a chilling effect when you know that in the context of those medical boards and in the context of the licensing boards, that's essentially what they're going to do. That's how Chiles versus Salazar ended up becoming a Supreme Court case, because the state of Colorado actively admitted that they were not just going to discipline and punish anyone that does conversion therapy, but it goes beyond just conversion therapy. It goes into professional speech. The Supreme Court decision in the Chiles versus Salazar case says professional speech, in essence, should still be protected alongside like personal speech, right? So your ability to speak on behalf of your patient and to speak on behalf of what you're seeing should still be protected, just like our First Amendment, constitutional right to free speech. That's what the Colorado Supreme Court is essentially against, right? And that's essentially part of the whole trickle down process with the Chiles versus Salazar case. And the latest iteration is now the state of Colorado is essentially saying, look, if we have people who are hurt by their therapists and their speech, right, they should be able to essentially sue their therapists. That's how the legislative process ends up essentially playing out. That's not just how politics ends up playing out, but that's where every single person coming into a different context based on the state ends up either getting regulated by whoever is on that board and what their views are, but more importantly, what the overarching sort of reflection of the laws that are in place would be for those states.
Okay.
That's also why I can make a qualification in Colorado. There is more of a requirement, and that requirement is not necessarily as spoken, but if you're a researcher and you specialize in this area and you're in regulatory, and that's also really where I come in with tons of data and case examples, and not just case examples, but actual like beyond charts. We had interviewed individuals as well as understanding the people that make up those boards. The only way to essentially challenge that is to challenge defining what unprofessional conduct is.
Okay, so I really want to make sure that we're kind of laying things out clearly step by step, right? So you've used this phrase that is in the law, unprofessional conduct, and that the Colorado Licensing Board gets to decide in Colorado what counts as unprofessional conduct. Do you recall, or can we look up what specifically is considered or was before Chiles versus Salazar? Because this is all leading up to basically where we're going. Listeners, this is a long story arc, right? Because we're leading to Colorado HB 26/1322, which is a reaction to Chiles versus Salazar, right? And so first you have to understand Chiles versus Salazar, which went to the Supreme Court to fight for free speech for therapists in Colorado to practice in accordance with their conscience. But in order to understand that, we need to understand this piece of what was Kayla or Kaylee, sorry, I forget. Kaylee Chiles. What was her complaint, right? And so it was that the Colorado law said that unprofessional conduct included, like, what specifically? What was the language in there?
Colorado's unprofessional conduct laws are actually much, much broader. The case went up against Colorado's ban on conversion therapy. So, on the legislative front, there was a ban on anyone that could be considered doing conversion therapy. How that ended up connecting to um, a licensed professional's speech and their license is Colorado and a host of a number of other states, around 20, have a very broad language within the regulatory codes. So if you look up your license regulated profession, so if you're in therapy, your state licensing board, they have a list of policies. If those policies essentially include something called unprofessional conduct, that is an arbitrary language that basically gives the board the ability to decide whether or not something that happens in the context of the profession is professional. You can lose your license essentially if they consider it not professional. In the context of Colorado, what Colorado has culturally done is it's regulated their professionals' speech. So, a couple of different examples in the Colorado attorney regulated profession. Uh, there was a case, like I said, of, uh, and you can Google this. It's not like it's essentially hidden. There is a lawyer that said "fat gay judge" by saying "gay" in a closed door context, and just being absolutely upset by a judge who made an unfair decision. He ends up going through a couple of different courses and gets a black mark on his license. That is the state of Colorado. In the context of a licensed therapist, that's also what ends up happening, right? So if you have a client that either comes to you really seeking help or unfortunately might not necessarily be a great client coming to you and trying to deceive, they make a reporting and says, my therapist is basically making me uncomfortable because I think they're practicing conversion therapy. The state of Colorado, because of both its laws and the individuals that make up that state within the licensing regulatory board, can consider that unprofessional conduct.
Okay. So actually, we're not saying things that are too terribly different because
We're not
when-
saying things that are terribly different. We're pushing alongside the lines of some states having a lot more of a legal requirement than other states.
So I just okay. Maybe we're workshopping like how my brain works versus how your brain
Sure.
works. Here's my understanding, right? When you say conversion therapy, that is defined in Colorado as
Yep.
SOGIECE, sexual orientation and gender identity and expression change efforts, correct?
Yes and no. So the state doesn't really define that. Lawyers have to essentially pull to define those things. That's part of the problem. We have to essentially pull from like federal regulations to start defining what something is, because within the context of the actual statute, the statute basically just says, you know, you can't practice conversion therapy. We're not necessarily going to define it, or we're going to defer that back to whatever the federal definition is.
So the
In the case of
statute that Chiles versus Salazar was contesting didn't include that acronym. It just said conversion therapy and it wasn't defined.
I can pull it up. Yeah, it didn't define it.
Okay, wow. This is new for me, right? Because this is my issue, right? Everyone knows this is like my claim to fame, like Helen Joyce, episode 11, where I got accused of conversion therapy. Like, this is how I ended up in the spotlight, right? And so my deep dive, not as a legal analyst, but as a therapist, was like understanding that like conversion therapy is defined as SOGIECE. And so I just assumed that in Colorado it was the same. And so that with Chiles versus Salazar, conversion therapy is defined as SOGIECE. And our problem is the GIE, and then the vagueness of the concept of change efforts. But I'm hearing it's even worse than that. It's even more vague. It's even more up to interpretation. So like what someone calls conversion therapy here is very subjective in the law. And so that's part of the problem that Chiles versus Salazar was addressing, if I understand you correctly. And now part of the backlash against Chiles versus Salazar, which is HB 26-1322, are you saying that likewise in this act, it's called Civil Actions for Conversion Therapy Survivors, it's also not defined?
Nope.
Okay, so tell us about the vagueness.
When you create a law, when you write anything into essentially policy, whoever is essentially writing that gets to essentially define whether or not they're going to broaden the definition or leave that up to legal interpretation. And when you leave certain sorts of things up to legal interpretation, then you're obviously always going to have groups that end up getting into lawfare and legal battles over the definition and the meaning of words. Right. So we have seen that, and perhaps all of law is about finding the true meaning of a particular legislative intent of a particular word. But it's even more the case when it comes to professional licensing and speech. There is no sort of inherent definition. If you're in the practice of medicine, there's a lot more words essentially to describe a condition, and that may not necessarily be true, mostly because people have like a lot more description. But in the context of law, when you're writing certain sorts of things in the context of the legislature, all of those words can mean all sorts of different things. So in the case of Childs, she was doing something called talk therapy. She was helping her clients, and she was essentially accused of conversion therapy. The same thing could happen in the legal context in the state of Colorado, and perhaps even beyond the state of Colorado. Whatever you end up doing not only ends up creating a public persona and perception, but as soon as essentially a license is challenged, and you have the actual legal words to trigger an investigation. And even if you don't have the legal words, you just happen to have a really bad client that says, I don't like my therapist, and I'm going to trigger a reporting, that triggers a whole legal process. We live in a healthcare legal system, which means you, with a good attorney, can sue anyone for practically anything. It's kind of scary, but that's lawfare. This law in Colorado just makes it a lot easier, because all you now need to essentially claim is, I've been hurt by someone doing conversion therapy.
And it's completely up to the patient or the aggrieved party to decide how they're interpreting the word conversion therapy. So what I want to contrast this with what it's not, right? Because you're highlighting just how vague it is, and it's even more vague than I thought it was. And let's contrast that with something like aversive conditioning or electroconvulsive therapy, right? These are defined forms of conversion therapy from the past that aren't done anymore, that are known to be abusive and not work, right? So something like aversive conditioning, uh, it's here's a creepy horror story I heard once, like a gay man whose therapist advised him to like smell dog poo while looking at pictures of naked men. That's aversive conditioning. Or electroconvulsive therapy. Okay, literally shocking someone as punishment for having the wrong thoughts. These are definable things. Like you can define if it happened or not, right? And of course, there's a case for seeking some kind of recourse if a professional were to engage in this kind of conduct. But it would also be equally unprofessional if a therapist were to employ the same techniques in response to something having nothing to do with gender or sexuality. If they were to try to treat obsessive compulsive disorder, well, okay, telling someone smell dog poo next time you want to do the compulsion, right? Like that is just as bad, and nobody would go to see that therapist anyway, right? So like I just want to contrast because that level of specificity is missing in this vague definition, up to the patient to say this person was trying to change this thing about me, right?
Yep. And it is. Like, so Colorado has a lot more patient-centric protections, I would say, which means all that you need to do essentially as a patient is say, "Hey, I feel extraordinarily uncomfortable with this professional, and I'm going to trigger a reporting, or I'm going to, seek after a lawyer." And that lawyer can very easily, because of their political ideology and um, belief that they're doing right, um, take you seriously and just go after the therapists for supposedly practicing conversion therapy.
Are you a therapist in need of continuing education that's not over the top woke? Check out my colleague Lisa Mustard's pod courses. All of her pod courses are approved by the National Board for Certified Counselors. Right now, Lisa is offering my listeners an incredible deal. Get all 27 pod courses for only $44. That could meet almost all of your continuing education needs for the year. Visit lisamustard.com/podcourses and use code SOMETHERAPIST to take $5 off of her $49 pod course bundle. Again, use code SOMETHERAPIST at lisamustard.com/podcourses. I'll include that link and coupon in the show notes for your convenience. All right, now back to the show. And I think it's notable in this law that patients' families can sue for damages up to 5 years after their death, which to me really seems like it's something that can open the floodgates, because we know that as much as suicide statistics have been exaggerated and manipulated for political gain, and that's not something that I condone on this podcast, so I always want to be very careful when we talk about the subject of suicide. That being said, we're looking at a population with higher than average rates of suicide and parasuicidal behavior, which can also be attributed to the overlap with cluster B personality disorders. Part of where I specialize is in educating parents in how to deal with the
Yeah.
intersection of gender identity issues and cluster B personality traits. And that's what my course is for, RGD
Ah.
repair, right? So we know that there is a high degree of overlap between patients who have gender identity issues and those who have cluster B personality traits. We know that the suicide level is pretty much on par with what you'd see with that level of
Yeah.
comorbidity with the other psychiatric diagnoses involved. So I don't want to just make it about the gender issue. That being said, we're looking at a population that is at increased risk of self-harm, self-injury, and suicide, and essentially saying their aggrieved loved ones now can potentially take out their frustration on a professional who tried to help by alleging
Yep.
that they tried to help in the wrong way, and this feels like it
Yes.
offers very little protection for the professional.
That's exactly what the language of the bill is set out to do.
And this is already every therapist's worst fear, by the way. In case listeners haven't thought of that, every therapist's worst fear is a patient completing suicide, and it's an occupational hazard that you learn how to live with. You learn how to mitigate risk, how to compartmentalize your feelings, how to assess the likelihood of risk, but also to live with that uncertainty. And many therapists, unfortunately, do go through that as part of their initiation at some point in their career. It can be humbling. It can create vicarious trauma for for the therapist, and of course, therapists tend to blame themselves, right? They tend to think like, "What could I have done differently? What should I have done differently?" Like therapists already carry the weight of that guilt on their conscience, and then to add to the equation that the patient's family could blame them.
That's this. That's the science force. Science force. That's really where, again, if you're practicing in the state of Colorado, and it's not just Colorado. Like I think most people kind of pin that sort of blame on the state of Colorado, but like it's probably even worse. Like in certain other states, Colorado has gotten a lot more national attention because it's the speech censorship state. So right now the battle is over whether or not all of these licensed professionals are going to have speech censored in terms of their practice. But if you go into perhaps the most liberal of the states when it comes to like speech censorship, which is Massachusetts, then you essentially run into the experience of then you can absolutely like pursue really crazy harmful treatment and have zero accountability for it. So that's what's really scary. So the things like electroshock therapy, smelling dog poop, the things that we think and would hope are not actually in practice right now, they are in practice under the guise of states that heavily, heavily protect the licensed professional and their license.
And that's Massachusetts, huh?
And that's Massachusetts.
I did not know this.
Mhm. Most people don't. Most people don't do a 50-state survey on, like, the various different regulatory powers, right? And the only way to fully actually go after and challenge it is to see the implication of how that works on a practical scale. That's why what I do is just I mean, I have to explain to people, like, 24/7, and then, you know, create charts like this and go in whatever other direction. But here's the good news. The good news is right now we're seeing a lot of that revealed within the mainstream media. We're seeing a lot of people who are talking about the chilling, damaging effects of healthcare gone wrong and terribly, terribly wrong. And the good news is we are also witnessing Lawfare essentially reveal uh, the undergirding issues within the context of the greater system and how not only does that need to be reformed, but how the next frontier is going to be on professional licensing. That's really where I come in and specialize, and it's kind of crazy how fast everything had moved since the time of the amicus.
I want listeners to understand the practical implications of things like this. Because that's why I point to the chilling effect, because I feel like it's kind of the best way for people to begin to understand, like, you're not going to find the therapist that you're looking for in this environment, right? It's not that there aren't therapists who share your views and concerns and who would love to help that patient in a holistic way. It's what would you do if you had gone into $100,000 of debt to get a master's degree and worked on 3,000 postgraduate hours, internship hours towards your license and studied hard to pass an exam, and you finally get your LMFT or LPC or LCSW or PsyD or whatever your professional license is, and you're finally in a position to do this work that you've been called to do potentially your whole life, helping people, talking about their feelings and their problems. You get to that position, and then you're faced with this threat that if you honor your conscience with regard to a young person who's confused about their gender, then you are not only at risk of threats to your license, you are at risk of civil penalties, of a
Yeah.
lawsuit, of being blamed for someone's tragic, untimely death. You are at risk of all that. What would you do as a professional? You'd probably not work with that population at all. You would probably find ways to turn down those patients, whether it's setting age requirements on your practice, whether it's how you market yourself. You're just not going to be open. You're just going to try to avoid it. Why? Because you want to practice therapy and you want to put food on the table and you want to save for retirement. And, between those things, like, that's why the parents in the audience listening who are frustrated as to why you can't find the type of therapist you want for your child or family, that's why. It's because of that effect. And it's not going to be as bad in every single state as it is in Colorado, but Colorado is a great example.
Yeah. So Colorado has been the epicenter for speech censorship on multiple fronts, including physicians and their speech. But it it definitely highlights a lot of this tension. So the tension that the Supreme Court says, look, you should be allowed to say what you consciously believe in. And it doesn't make sense that just because you're a therapist, just because you're a doctor, just because you're a licensed professional, that's going to curb your speech. The liberal justices on that court also agree, right? The chilling effect does not make sense. But in this context of the state of Colorado, their retaliatory efforts is then we'll make this a tort issue. And what a tort issue is it basically allows, okay, if you end up practicing in that state and let's say somebody ends up dying or committing suicide or whatever, right, you can then blame someone who is deemed by that state to be practicing conversion therapy. That's the chilling effect. And that's not just the chilling effect, that's rightly what you're discovering as being haunting. And that's also what most other individuals, massive tink political members, don't realize, because no one's actually ever going to get into healthcare licensing and healthcare regulatory unless you specialize in that topic. And the people that end up specializing in that topic from the other side are essentially guardrailing and safeguarding the entirety of that system.
And so what's being done to fight back?
This war. So healing science is going to fight back. That's a lot of what I'm doing right now. Basically rallying the licensed professionals and the physicians and the scientists and the people who are essentially seeing that it is a war within the context of their regulated profession. It is literally a war over whether or not you as a licensed professional can do what's right.
Well, thank you, Diana, for the work that you're doing on that front.
We're unraveling that. And I think the first sort of element there is to start going after something called unprofessional conduct and start defining that. So thank you for making me reveal that as not just the next step, but as the broadest thing of what I'm doing right now, which is fundraising for that.
Yeah, I mean, so what I'm really hearing is that the phrase unprofessional conduct is not defined in Colorado. It's subjective.
And
it's open to
in 20 other
interpretation.
states. Yep.
And I mean, I think the good-natured part of me, the more trusting part of me, would like to believe that we all have some kind of common sense shared definition of something like unprofessional conduct, like showing up to work naked or drunk or, things like that are just obviously unprofessional, but what's
Yep.
deemed professional and unprofessional has
Oh,
changed so much that
it's not just change. So the most chilling thing is I had during law school did a 50-page study on not just that word, but all the times that licensed professional has been disciplined. And what you find is that about 50% of the cases that I had focused on that didn't, that wasn't about drug misuse was actually far more political. It was over whether or not someone had triggered a reporting. There was a case where, like, and this was completely stupid because it still occurred. Like, someone gave Jello to their patient. So a midwife essentially gave Jello to a patient under the direction of a nurse. And instead of the nurse getting in trouble, she got in trouble for giving that patient Jello because um, there was an OB-GYN that did not necessarily like the midwife being in the room because she was actually advocating for that patient. That's essentially lawfare. That's the types of cases that are out there. And despite having the patient who provided evidence that this person was literally just caught in the crossfires of political power, they still gave a mark against that professional's license. And that's part of the reason why we don't have enough, if not more, individuals that are championing and actively speaking out because they're terrified of having another sort of mark legally on their license. The good news is, again, we can change a lot of that by literally just looking at the governmental regulatory language and defining what something is, whether or not something is unprofessional conduct or not. But in order to do that, that is essentially waging another form of war. That's how Do No Harm got to be so successful, because they went into the legislation and started actually actively defining what they're going to essentially pursue as not just an organization, but in terms of gender affirming care, what that really entailed. That's the battle. And that's I know it might sound depressing, but the good news is this. When people are aware that an issue exists, it gives them a lot more hope and courage to essentially start rising up and start talking about it. Because we haven't seen that. We've been on the front of a lot of the detransitioner issues, and that is amazing. And they're essentially waiting for a healthcare reform. A lot of those cases.
Well, thank you for your advocacy, Diana. And having studied cases in which professionals were sanctioned, um, I'm sure you saw that it's not black or white, in the sense that not everyone who is the subject of some kind of professional complaint loses their license over that issue. So I do just want to remind listeners of that, because I think when I hear from lay people on this issue, they tend to think of it that way. It's like, no, a complaint or even a lawsuit, which are two different things, by the way, don't necessarily mean loss of license, but it's, what most people need to just bear in mind is the process is the punishment, and most people don't want to go through the process, even if their actions are defensible. And so I'm sure you've seen plenty of that in your review of cases.
Yeah, and it goes beyond the process. It really does go into whether or not, on the legal professional level, if a case can prevail. And unfortunately, within the context of law, anything that happens on the front of any sort of regulated profession is going to be dependent upon the standards of care that are essentially governing that profession. So everything in terms of unprofessional conduct, that language, across 20 different states actually, is defined as set by professional associations. That's essentially what's in the regulation. That's within the policy. So in Colorado, as set by professional associations, who are they going to end up looking to as professional associations? Whatever organizations, national organization and otherwise, end up dictating what that licensed professional should be practicing.
For counseling, a lot of states look toward the ACA Code of Ethics from 2013. And I would encourage anyone who really wants to geek out on this issue to go ahead and take a look at the ACA Code of Ethics from 2013, because a lot of it is pretty basic and most people would sign on board with. And then some of it is on the woke side. And, when counselors are required to put in their professional disclosure statement, something like, I abide by the ACA Code of Ethics, they're essentially signing off on some pretty woke policies. So that's one place that I would look if anyone wants to look a little further into this issue. But Diana, thank you so much for your advocacy. Where can people find you?
Right now, healscience.org is the best website. That's the collection of a ton of healthcare professionals, physicians and scientists and others that had supported Kennedy's shift and are part of this healthcare revolution.
Very cool. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your bright spirit. Thank you for listening to You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. If you enjoyed this episode, kindly take a moment to rate, review, share, or comment on it using your platform of choice. And of course, please remember, podcasts are not therapy, and I'm not your therapist. Special thanks to Joey Pecoraro for this awesome theme song, Half Awake, and to Pods by Nick for production. For help navigating the impact of the gender craze on your family, be sure to check out my program for parents, ROGD Repair. Any resource you heard mentioned on this show, plus how to get in touch with me, can all be found in the notes and links below. Rain or shine, I hope you will step outside to breathe the air today. In the words of Max Ehrmann, with all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world.